Welcome to Shellphone, the podcast that gives the ocean its very own hotline. It's time to answer the ocean's call. Join us as we learn all about marine science, education, and conservation. This podcast is brought to you by Breach the Surface and Coastal Creative, and this episode is sponsored by Chopping Block Soaps. I'm Harmony Dawson, and joining us today is Jessica Sportelli, who's a marine bioacoustics specialist with the National Marine Mammal Foundation. Hi, Jessica. Thanks for joining us here today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Before we get into the topics of this episode, can you give us an introduction to your background and how your interest in marine science started?
Absolutely. So I'm originally from Los Angeles, and I didn't quite want to be a marine biologist when I was growing up, which I think is a much different story than a lot of people who end up in the marine biology field have. So I grew up in LA. I was raised in a really big theater and dance family. So all of my early background is in performing arts. And I originally wanted to dance on Broadway or be a Shakespeare actor. And it wasn't until my junior year of high school when I actually got really interested in science and animal behavior and marine biology specifically. So I remember one summer between my junior and senior year, I had an internship at the Marine Mammal Center up in San Francisco, working with the seals and sea lions that they would rescue. And then that same summer, I went and did a Shakespeare summer intensive up in Oregon. So just two very different worlds, me trying to piece them together. And then I got scuba certified that same summer, which was really fun, and was really confused by the end of high school. I didn't really know what to apply to colleges for. So half of the universities I got into were for biology and the other half were for theater. And so I actually ended up going to community college at Moore Park Community College in LA and had a really great time. I did both theater and biology. And I just had this incredible zoology professor, Dr. Jana Johnson, who just continued to stoke the flames of being a scientist and a researcher. And I ended up transferring to UC San Diego and Scripps Institution of Oceanography to get my bachelor's and later my master's degree. And I loved whales and dolphins. I thought they were really beautiful animals and really interesting. And so I knew I wanted to work with them, but I didn't quite know what field I would be in. And so as an undergrad, I volunteered at the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center out in San Diego, and I was in a wet lab. So we were looking at micropipetting hormones and chemicals into tubes, and that was really cool, but I didn't really love it. And then I took a marine mammal biology class, and the professor was a bioacoustician. So he studied the sounds that dolphins and whales made. And I ultimately started volunteering in his lab, and that's where I ended up doing my master's thesis.
Awesome. That is definitely something that I can relate to, of having diverging interests. The college that I went to, one half of it is that everybody goes there for marine science, and the other half is it has a really great arts community. And I've always been really interested in creative writing. So I've always looked for a way to merge environmental science with something more creative. So I definitely get that.
And it's so possible. I thought I had to pick one over the other, but the further I go into my career, I'm realizing that I can do both of those things, which has been really exciting.
So you do now a lot of work with acoustics and bioacoustics.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
Yeah, so bioacoustics is the study of sound made by living things. And we humans are really visual creatures. So we rely on our eyesight. We have a lot of light around us. We read body language. But marine mammals in the ocean have evolved to have really special hearing and really special communication of vocal communication. So why is that? When you think about it, 90% of the ocean is pitch black. Their light does not penetrate too deeply into the ocean. And so if you're relying on your eyesight to see one another, that's not going to be helpful. There's a lot of marine mammals that are some of the deepest divers in the animal kingdom, like sperm whales and beaked whales. And so to be able to vocally communicate with each other is really advantageous. When there is light in the ocean, it can get really murky as well. If you've ever gone snorkeling or scuba diving where the visibility is really bad because there's a lot of wind and sediment and you can't see your friend next to you, vocal communication is going to come in handy there. And then the other reason they've evolved like that is sound travels really fast in water. Sound travels 4 times faster in water than it does in air. And so you can communicate over really long distances and stay in touch with your pod members that way. So knowing that we're able to step into a world that the animals are really evolved to take up. There's this really great word in animal behavior called umwelt, and it's the idea that you're studying the world as the animal perceives it. So dogs are really good with their sense of smell. Whales and dolphins are really good with their acoustic communication and their hearing. So I'll focus on whales and dolphins, though, in terms of what kind of sounds we study from them. So you have 2 types of whales. You have your mysticetes, which are your big whales with baleen. So those are your blue whales, your fin whales, your humpback whales. And then you have your odontocetes, and those are your toothed whales. So like the sperm whales, dolphins, porpoises, narwhals, belugas. And they make very different sounds from one another. So the mysticetes, your baleen whales, have really low frequency calls. And you could think of frequency as the pitch of your vocal communication. So big whales have really low frequency calls that they can use to communicate with each other over ocean basins. Like these low frequency calls travel really far because of the way that sound and water interacts. A great example of that is humpback whales that sing during mating season. These males can sing for hours and hours at a time. And I'm sure we've all heard the humpback whale songs and how hauntingly beautiful they are. And then for your toothed whales, they have evolved to have a really cool skill called echolocation. And so bats do this too, but they're able to produce these clicks that they put out into the water, and then they wait for that echo to come back to them. Kind of like when you're standing in a cave and you shout something and your echo comes back to you. So echolocation is how those animals are able to navigate and hunt for the fish that they're trying to eat. The other way that odontocetes communicate is through whistles or pulsed calls. So when you think of dolphin whistles or killer whale whistles, that's what I'm talking about. And whistles are a way to identify yourself. A great example of that is in bottlenose dolphins. They have a signature whistle, which kind of acts like a name tag for them. And they're able to communicate a lot of information within that whistle that is also a name tag. And then whistles are also really good for keeping your pod together. Killer whales have these dialects or these family calls that are recognizable by the family that you're traveling with. Yeah, lots of different sounds that these animals are making, including tail slaps and pectoral slaps, and breaching also counts as acoustic communication as well.
Does that difference in the types of sounds that those 2 groups of whales make, toothed versus baleen, have to do with their biology, like what type of teeth or not teeth they have?
Oh, interesting. I don't know. I think it has more to do with what they're eating. So yeah, so that would depend on the type of teeth you have. Dolphins and sperm whales and killer whales are eating fast-moving fish. So you'll need to be able to track your prey as it moves throughout the water column to be able to grab it. Humpback whales and blue whales are typically lunge feeders, and so they'll open their mouth really wide to gather up that ball of krill, and then siphon that out. So echolocation comes in really handy when you're trying to hunt for fast moving prey.
What kinds of tools do you use to study the sounds that animals make?
Yeah, absolutely. So we use hydrophones, which are underwater microphones, and those come in a variety of shapes and sizes. So they can come in, small handheld devices that you can throw into the ocean or a lake just right off of the boat. Some of them are huge and can sit at the bottom of the ocean for months at a time. That's how I did my master's thesis, is we had acoustic devices planted up in the Canadian Arctic that would just sit there for a year. And then we would have to go back and collect all that data. And then some animal tags will have hydrophones or microphones on them as well. If you've ever heard of a D tag, that gets suction cupped on to the back of a whale, sometimes those have microphones in them too. And so when those tags pop off, you can then collect that tag and download the data.
Cool. That actually leads pretty well into what I wanted to talk about next, which was your master's program.
Yeah.
So to kind of get us started with that, what did you study during your master's and where? Because that's super interesting part of it.
Yeah, so I was at Scripps Institution of Oceanography here in San Diego, and I studied killer whale acoustic communication in the Eastern Canadian Arctic. So that was really fun because the intent of deploying these hydrophones out in that area was not originally for killer whale detection, but what's happening in the Arctic right now is that we're seeing less and less ice form in the winter, and in the summer it's retreating sooner, it's forming later. And what that's bringing with it are these apex predators like killer whales who weren't able to navigate through the ice before. And they've been seen hunting narwhals and bowhead whales, which are two very Arctic specific species. And so we wanted to know, who were these killer whales showing up, where are they coming from, and what impact are they having on the narwhals. And so killer whales are a cosmopolitan species. They occur in every ocean around the world. But like I said, narwhals and bowheads only occur up in the Arctic. And killer whales are apex predators, and they've also been called ecosystem engineers, meaning they can exert a lot of influence on the environment that they're in just by what they eat and how they travel. And so I set out to describe the killer whale calls that we were recording on two hydrophones, one in a known narwhal summering aggregation site, and the other one in at the mouth of that waterway called Eclipse Sound. And so where we were in the world was in northern Baffin Island in Nunavut, Canada, around a town called Pond Inlet. And the Inuit that live there say they've seen narwhals clumping together when killer whales are in the area, and that more killer whales are showing up every year and they're staying for longer. And like I said, it has to do with that decreasing ice that we're seeing in the Arctic as well. What's cool about killer whales and their calls is that they have very specific call behavior, call repertoires based on the pod and where they live in the world. So one example is in the Pacific Northwest, where you have your southern resident killer whales, your transient killer whales, and your offshore killer whales. They're all making unique calls for their own ecotype or their group of killer whale. And so the thought was, can we identify these killer whales based on what calls that they're making? And can we use those calls to track them throughout the North Atlantic and see where they're coming from? And then our second question was, what are the narwhal doing in response to this new predator in their backyard? And so I identified 11 unique call types in that data that ranged for a year in 2017. And we also then found that narwhals in their echolocation clicks stop echolocating when the killer whales are around, which was such a drastic response. At this narwhal summer aggregation site, they're constantly clicking and feeding and hanging out. And then one killer whale call comes in and it stops. And what we think is happening is they're getting really quiet. And following that Inuit knowledge, they're clumping closer to shore and they're trying to be inconspicuous to the killer whales in the area. And then on the flip side of that, killer whales that hunt marine mammals typically don't make a lot of acoustic noise because their prey can eavesdrop on their calls and whistles. So we saw this really interesting behavioral reaction, and we were able to put that together, and that created the foundation of who these whales might be and what the impact on the narwhals is.
That is super interesting. I feel like already we've gotten a sense that there are a lot of different purposes and uses for making sound in the ocean, like a lot of overlapping things there.
Yeah, what's cool is like you can ask so many different questions off of one data set. So you throw the hydrophone in the water, you leave it there for a year, and you can come back and you can notice patterns in your data and then start to ask questions of, why am I seeing that? When did these animals show up? Why are they showing up? How long have they been here compared to data from 2012 or even our data was from 2017. Was there differences in 2016 and 2015? And you can see these really cool patterns and start to ask really interesting questions. We often have more questions than answers as you go down the scientific process, but it's fun.
If I'm remembering correctly, you said that you were looking at a presence of killer whales that wasn't necessarily seen as much before. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we know from talking with the Inuit in the area that the presence of killer whales have been increasing steadily over time. It's not that they've never been seen in the Eastern Canadian Arctic before, but they've never been seen at this frequency with these many killer whales. And so that's concerning because the Inuit rely on hunting the narwhal for their food, and they have been for centuries, maybe even thousands of years. And so to have this apex predator come into the community and now be competition for the Inuit, they have questions and we have questions. And so being able to work together, especially incorporating that traditional indigenous knowledge, is so important when we're conducting these types of studies because there are eyes and ears up there. They know that land, they know those animals better than I could ever. So being able to work with them and come up with answers is really satisfying.
Yeah, that's something that I have been interested in for a long time, is the Arctic ecosystem in general, but then how people who are actually living there know so much more about it, like partially because they're there and seeing it every day compared to me, especially because the Arctic is so far away from me and wherever I've been. And just the general idea of needing to work with people who are actually tied into whatever ecosystem that you're looking at.
Yeah, no, I can only echo how important incorporating that type of knowledge is into creating that full picture for us. I think it's happening more and more. I think there's more of an awareness around how important that is. But of course, we can always do better.
I'm curious about the shift from that, where you were looking at killer whales and narwhals, to now where you're looking at dolphins mostly. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So luckily, they're all in the same family. Killer whales are just really big dolphins. And so the only shift I had to make when I left my master's thesis and started working at the National Marine Mammal Foundation, looking at now dolphin whistles, was just learning the specifics about bottlenose dolphin communication and purpose versus killer whales. So I had mentioned earlier that bottlenose dolphins have these signature whistles that's very specific for that group of animals, where killer whales have those pod-specific pulsed calls. So that was the only real difference. But the skills that I learned in my graduate program and at Scripps in general helped me conduct the research that I do at the foundation. So it's all hydrophone maintenance and data organization and looking at spectrograms on a computer. Spectrograms are how we look at the recordings that we took of the animals. So all of those skills were the same. It's now just learning new facts about the specific animal you're looking at. And luckily, there's so much research out there. We've been studying dolphin signature whistles since the 60s. So it was a lot of reading, a lot of catching up on the science, and then being able to move forward and do my own.
Awesome. And so the National Marine Mammal Foundation, what is their overall focus or goal as a organization?
Yeah. So the National Marine Mammal Foundation is a nonprofit. We're based in San Diego, and we are really focused on conservation and service and educational outreach for marine mammals across the globe. So we have a huge team of conservation biologists that research bioacoustics and dolphin hearing, and that influences the way we can help conserve mammals worldwide. We also have this incredible team of marine mammal veterinarians that get to, participate in really cool field work and research on dolphin health. And that's really important because as we continue to see a lot of the damage that happens to our planet, specifically around impacts of oil spills. I think we just celebrated the 15th anniversary of the BP oil spill. The foundation has been really instrumental in working with the animals in that region to understand long-term health implications of an oil spill. And, looking at the way that ice is moving and disease. Right now in California, we're having a domoic acid toxicity explosion. We had a lot of rain and the oceans are warm, and that rain brought in a lot of runoff into the ocean. And so this harmful algal bloom is happening, and the sea lions and dolphins and whales are getting really sick, and they're coming to shore. So all of the research that we're able to do at the foundation is helping us go out into the world and make it better. And then we also do a lot of educational outreach in the San Diego and South Carolina community as well.
What does your specific role or work look like?
Yeah, so the last research project that I was a part of was called Sound and Health. And we were looking at the way that dolphin whistles change when they get sick, or if they change when they get sick. So you and I sound sick when we get sick, and you can tell when your friend is sick, right? Like they sound a little quiet, or they're talking slower, they're kind of raspy. And we're able to diagnose human pathology by the way our voice changes. And so knowing that dolphins and marine mammals are such vocal and acoustic species, our question was, do their whistles change when they get sick? And then can we use that to monitor the health of dolphin populations around the world? So it was a really amazing project. We were able to partner with the US Navy's Marine Mammal Program in San Diego and the dolphins with that program. We've been passively recording those animals for the past 6 years. So we know pretty much everyone's signature whistle. And what was fun about that project is we were able to go to the dolphins and ask them to whistle for us. So that was our data collection process. We trained dolphins with the help of the amazing animal care professionals and veterinarians that we have at the foundation to whistle for us on a hand signal. And then we would bring that data back into the lab, and through machine learning algorithms, we were able to understand what differences whistles have when animals are sick or not sick. And it's really promising, the results that we're getting. And I'm excited to see where that research and that data is going to go. The project was led by Dr. Brittany Jones, who's just an incredible researcher. And yeah, we've got some exciting stuff coming up in that field.
Yeah. To hear you describe the reasoning behind why dolphin whistles might tell us something about their health, it makes a lot of sense, but it's definitely a question that I would not have thought of on my own. And that's part of the reason why I love talking to researchers, is because there's so much that I just haven't thought of yet. And it's also kind of funny that we're recording this after I'm getting over being sick for a couple of weeks. You could definitely tell.
Yeah.
I definitely had that raspiness going on. What is the importance of looking into that question specifically, or general questions about marine mammal health? Or
Yeah. Yeah. So dolphins are very stoic animals behaviorally when they're sick. So that means that they don't show you that they're sick until they're really, really sick. And being able to step into that acoustic world, like I mentioned at the beginning, has helped us answer some of these questions. So if we were just to rely on watching a population of animals as they swam around in an oil spill, it might look fine, like they're fine. They're still diving, they're coming up for air. But acoustically, what is the difference? And that being able to answer that in a non-invasive way of we can deploy hydrophones in these environments that have been impacted by either natural disasters or anthropogenic disasters, or even in areas that are thriving, like environments that are thriving, to compare the differences is a really great way to be able to monitor the health of ecosystems.
you mentioned oil spills a couple times. I'm curious what some of the major impacts oil spills have on dolphins are.
So what we've been seeing in the Barataria Bay area, where that BP oil spill occurred 15 years ago, is higher mortality rates for the resident population of dolphins there. We're seeing an increased prevalence of moderate to severe lung disease as animals are breathing in all of that oil at the surface. We're seeing an impaired stress response and high rates of reproductive failure for the population and just overall poor health in general. You know, it's important to remember that these animals can't escape the water. And so when the water isn't healthy, those animals aren't going to be healthy either. And because those animals are so residential to that area, they're not going to go anywhere else. That's their home. So luckily, we're able to look at those impacts, and hopefully future disasters can be mitigated for with the results that we're finding.
Great, thank you. Thank you to Chopping Block Soaps for sponsoring this episode of Shellphone. This family-owned business makes my favorite soaps out there. They are dedicated to using high-quality, natural ingredients to create their handmade soaps and skincare products. One of my favorites is the Utah. This soap is made with shea and cocoa butter, coconut and olive oil, cedarwood and lavender essential oils, sage, beetroot, water, and lye. That's it. To browse Chopping Block Soap's selection of products, go to their website at choppingblocksoap.com and use the discount code Shellphone for 20% off your order. When talking about dolphin health, what are the most important sort of environmental factors, if this is applicable, that impact dolphins? Like, for example, we just did a recording about corals and they have a really low heat tolerance. Is there any environmental factor kind of like that that is really important for dolphins and their health?
Yeah, definitely. So, gosh, there's a few answers I can give you. One is as more fresh water starts to come into the environment, dolphin skin is not prepared to handle that. And so we're seeing a lot of skin health issues where exposure to fresh water has been really bad for dolphin skin. We're also seeing, respiration issues in dolphins can be one of the highest causes of mortality. When you think about where the dolphin blowhole is, it's at the top of their head, and they don't have hair in their nasal cavity like we do. And so when you have unhealthy water, when that dolphin comes up to breathe and exhale and inhale, those pathogens are getting into their lungs. So pneumonia is a big deal. And then, of course, entanglement from interacting with fishing nets and trash and plastic is a big issue, and ship strike as well. So physically getting hit by ships.
This kind of switches gears back to a question I asked earlier and a different topic from health, but back on the acoustics train, I asked earlier what kind of tools you use to study that, but can you expand on what that whole process looks like from collecting data to analyzing it? And are you just like wearing headphones and listening really closely to animal calls for hours on end, or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, great question. So it depends on what your research question is. There are people that are sitting on ships right now listening for animals so that the ship can avoid the animal, or especially if you're using instruments that are going to make noise, like a sonar fish finder, you want to know what animals are in the area. So yes, there are people sitting and listening and watching a screen of that acoustic monitoring coming through in real time. For the Sound and Health project, like I mentioned, we were able to ask the dolphins to communicate and whistle for us. So we had a little laptop and a hydrophone that we would dip in the water, get whistles, 5 whistles from the animal, say thank you very much, and move on, and bring that data back into the lab, download it, and then sit there and pick out each whistle that we wanted to use. For that specific project, we then took that data and put it into this machine learning algorithm that we built and trained to analyze the sound file that we would give it. And then for something like my master's thesis, that data just sat in the Arctic until we could go up in the summer to collect it and switch out the hard drives. So sometimes you're on a boat and your hands are wet and you're out in the sun, and sometimes you're sitting in your office waiting for that data to come back to you. When that data does come back to you, it's a lot of data to manage. And so there's a lot of processing of that data. You're scanning it to make sure you're finding the calls that you want to find, or perhaps there are no calls that you want to find. And that's, an interesting answer too. Or you're looking at ship noise. You can measure the sound levels in the environment. You can measure water temperature with some of these instruments and ask, how does that influence what animals are in the area? So it's a lot of sitting at a computer. It's a lot of data processing. It's a lot of Excel sheets. And then we get to write up our findings after doing a lot of statistical tests and publish our papers and present that to the world. And then you move on to the next part of the project.
I can imagine there's also a lot of ambient noise that you have to listen to before you get to a particular call that you're looking for. Is that true?
Oh, yeah. Sometimes it's hours and hours of recordings until you find the animal that is calling. But sometimes that's what you want to know about, is that ambient noise, especially when you think about, one of the biggest threats to marine mammals right now is noise pollution and how loud the ocean has gotten since we've started shipping across the oceans. Since we've started shipping, ambient noise in the ocean has increased by like 10 decibels or more. And that's a big jump. And so if you want to compare the soundscape of one environment to another and how that might have an impact on the animals in your area, that's a really good question to ask. Sometimes you want to find where those ships are and listen to the ships, because shipping noise can mask a lot of communication that the whales are making. So if they overlap with one another, the louder sound, like the ship noise, is going to cover up the whale calls. And then your whale friend can't hear the calls that you're trying to make. And so listening to that ambient noise and to those other anthropogenic noises can be really important to understanding what you're trying to understand.
if you had like a stationary hydrophone, are you able to tell like how far away a whale is from it when it makes a call? Or
Yeah, sometimes. So it depends on how many hydrophones you have in an array. So an array is a bunch of hydrophones together. If you only have one hydrophone, you can't really tell where that animal is coming from. But if you have two or four or six, and you're able to tell when the call hits one hydrophone compared to when it hits another hydrophone, you can find that time delay and be able to locate the animal that is calling. So that's really cool. Sometimes we can track animals as they swim across the range, and how deep they go and when they come back up. So that's a really fun tool to be able to use.
that is really cool. So we already touched on this a little bit when talking about the different situations that you would collect data in, but what are some challenges of studying animals in the wild versus in other settings, or just challenges that you have to take on when you want to be studying these big animals that the only option is to look at them in the wild?
Yeah. So I get seasick. So that's a big challenge. Being out on a boat, that's not fun all the time. But also, field work can be so fun and special and thrilling when you're going out there and you're looking at these animals that you've wanted to see and have so many questions about. And at the same time, the ocean is a really big place. And so sometimes you're waiting on that boat or you're waiting on the shore for 8 hours and the animal you're looking for just doesn't show up that day. And that's okay because they have a whole life. So, you're waiting a lot, you're out in the elements. So depends on how good the sea state is that day or the sun exposure or the wind exposure. I got to do some field work up in Canada in Churchill, Manitoba, looking at beluga whale behavior. And I was there in July at like the peak of their mosquito season. And I'm someone who just gets eaten alive by mosquitoes. So that was a real challenge. But on a more serious note and on a more like science global note, sometimes you're in these really remote parts of the country or in the world. And sometimes it's not safe for you to be there, whether you're a woman or you're a person of color or you're disabled or queer. Like there are parts of our country that you're not safe to be in those areas or internationally. And so I think one of the challenges that needs to be addressed is just overall safety and acceptance of people in those spaces. A lot of field work is not accessible to all people. And what I'm really proud about at the foundation is that we're advancing guidelines aimed towards protecting students and researchers when they go out into the field and making sure you look at where we're going, what we're doing, how long we're going to be there for, what community are we connecting with, to make sure that those environments are safe for everyone to be a part of. So that's a science-wide issue, not just a dolphin research issue, but it's certainly something that could be improved.
Yeah, I think that is a good point to bring up because it's not one that we've really talked about much, is the human's place in field work. We've talked about like getting seasick or, having to be out in these remote conditions, but not necessarily the personal challenges of it or the societal challenge.
Yeah, and we need everyone to be involved in this type of work. And so let's not exclude people. Let's invite them in and make sure that the space is inclusive for everybody.
Yeah. And I think it's great that if for whatever reason you're not able or wanting to do a specific type of work, you can still be part of a team that's studying the topic that you want to study, and you can do a different part of that work. Or if you're really interested in like writing papers and that's like your jam, you could work with somebody potentially who does the more heavy hands-on side, and then you collaborate on the translating that into communication. So there's definitely a place, but sometimes that, like you said, that place we need to work on making space for. people more.
Yeah. Yeah. And just that concept of collaboration is so important in science. Like, I don't know how to create a machine learning algorithm. We worked with computer scientists to do that. And then, to bring it all the way back around, that's why we need artistic, creative writing, theater kid people in sciences so that that work is communicated to people from different audiences and we can tell different stories with the data that we're collecting. No matter what your skill set is, if you like drawing or you like computer science or you like going out and getting muddy and bitten by mosquitoes, there's a place for you in science and in marine biology. And so we need all types of people to be a part of it.
That's kind of a good transition point into the last topic that I wanted to talk about, which is the community outreach side of the research that you've done and what that looks like, how the information that you've found has been translated into something that you can share with the general public, or how you can get them involved in that work. So can you kind of tell us a little bit about what that looks like at the foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love working with the public and telling them all about the fun things that we get to do and learn about in animal behavior and animal communication. So at the National Marine Mammal Foundation, we have this great community outreach program, and we've developed these classroom workshops and youth summer series, and we work with the Girl Scouts of America, and we work with like a place called the Ocean Discovery Institute, which is doing amazing work and connecting people, children and adults, to issues that they care about and that are happening in their backyard. I think something like 60% of the population in America lives near the coast. And so to be able to get people interested and involved in protecting that coast and the ocean is really important. So some of the youth initiatives we have is a program called Dolphin Doctor, where you learn all about being a dolphin veterinarian. And at the foundation, we've been able to offer that program in both English and in Spanish, which has been really fun. And we have this summer program, or not summer program, but we have a high school program for students to get involved in learning about the southern resident killer whales. And at the end of that program, they do a project based on communicating the science towards their classmates on why we should protect this super endangered species. And so getting people the experience of communicating science, but also giving them solutions to take home with them, I feel is the most important part of any outreach that you can do. So for kids, we tell them, make sure you're throwing your trash in trash cans. For adults, it can look something like, call your representative. It's not that scary, I promise. I was really scared the first time I did it, but it's really easy. There's scripts online, there's apps you can download. But calling your representative, getting involved in beach cleanups on the weekends, or even just going out there and doing it yourself with your family is a fun activity. Promoting for plastic-free options, visiting your local aquariums and zoos. They have incredible outreach programs and they do a lot of research as well. So yeah, giving people the solutions to the problems is a really important part in the outreach that we do. And also connecting with children across the San Diego County is just a really fun. They have the funniest questions and they're really excited when you're talking to them about dolphins and sea lions, because who wouldn't be?
I love that you mentioned the educational programs have both an English and a Spanish version. That's something that I'm seeing the different nonprofits that I work with try to approach, of being more accessible language-wise. And that's definitely something that I have no experience in because I can only speak one language, but I wish I could speak more. But yeah.
Yeah, for San Diego, I'm 30 minutes away from the Mexican border. We have a huge Spanish-speaking population in Southern California. And so to be able to reach out to them is just as important.
Yeah, definitely. For my final question, this is really silly, but with your theater background, And since you study like acoustics and animal songs, have you ever thought about like a musical, but it's whales singing?
Wow, just like an hour and a half of whale sounds playing in
Yeah.
a dark theater sounds incredible. Okay, actually, two things just came to mind. One, we're talking about like communicating our science in different creative outlets. In grad school, and in a lot of universities do this actually, there will be challenges on how to interpretate your thesis, either through interpretive dance or through a theatrical creative mean. So at UCSD and at Scripps, they had a dance your thesis competition where you would create this interpretive dance on what you were studying. And this girl from my lab, Natalie, who is also a dancer, I think won that competition. She was studying sperm whale clicks. And so, yes, there are, opportunities out there. The other thing that came to mind, and I might get some of these specifics wrong, but the reason why people started caring about protecting the whales, especially the humpback whales, I think it was in the 60s or 70s. You'll have to fact check me. But we started recording humpback whale calls and we put them on a vinyl. And it was like the number one best-selling album of that year because people just loved listening to these whale songs. And we sent it into space. There's like a recording of whale songs floating around in space right now. And that was really the catalyst on how people started to care about protecting whales in the ocean. And I just think that's so beautiful that it was something akin to music that we were connecting with that brought us to care about these animals. So, yes, lots of opportunities for creative, theatrical, musical experiences.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I guess that brings us to the end of the episode. So thank you so much for joining us on Shellphone. It was great to finally get to talk with you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
Thanks for tuning into Shellphone. To learn more about our projects, suggest a guest, or donate to the show, go to our website at breachthesurface.org. You can also find us on Instagram at breachthesurface and at Shellphone Podcast. Whether you're listening on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or another streaming platform, be sure to subscribe to the show so that you can stay up to date on our episodes. To learn more about the National Marine Mammal Foundation, you can go to their website at nmmf.org or find them on Instagram at nmmfoundation. And to connect with Jessica, you can find her on LinkedIn. If you're especially interested in whales, there's a podcast that I listened to help prepare for this episode called the Whale Tales Podcast. I would highly suggest going to check it out. I listened to episode 71, which is about the acoustics of the Peel's dolphins, and it features two researchers who wrote a paper about this. So go check it out.